Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our in-house guests, we do ask that courtesy check that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome at any time to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, the program will be posted on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference following our presentations. Leading our discussion this morning is Hella Dale, who serves as Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. She began her career, however, in journalism, working for both domestic and foreign publications, and has written a weekly foreign affairs column for more than 2 decades now. She is a media fellow at the Hoover Institution, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and serves on the Board of Visitors of the Institute for Political Journalism at Georgetown University and the Board of Center for Free Inquiry at Hanover College. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Hella Dale. Hella?
Thank you, John. And thank you to all of you for coming today for this event, which promises to be not only very important, but also very fascinating. Winter is Coming, Observations from the Baltic States. That is the title of a great, highly readable new paper by our first speaker today, Colin Dueckon, a professor from George Mason University and a visiting scholar with American Enterprise Institute. Colin has produced this paper at the initiative of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and it is to be found in their October 18 edition. So he will start out our presentation based on research he did during a period of travel there this summer. Responding to that will be Jacob Griegel, who is from the policy planning staff of the U.S. Department of State. Formerly, I believe, a scholar with the Center for European Policy Analysis. And finally, we have our own Ted Drummond, who is a senior research fellow in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom here at the Heritage Foundation. So let's get started. Colin, would you like to come up here for your presentation, or?
I can just speak from here if that's okay.
You prefer.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So I should start by saying that I'm sure there's people in the room that know more about the Baltic states than I do. My expertise really over the years has been the relationship between presidential leadership, national security strategies, and domestic politics. And so I've written a number of books and articles on that, especially from the conservative Republican side. But I was lucky enough to be able to go to the Baltics this summer and interviewed, I think, about 30 different government officials, defense, political, economic, diplomatic, in all 3 Baltic states, and as well as some NGOs. And it was very educational. And there were some commonalities. There were also some interesting differences. So this is the starting point. In terms of the threat perception, there was a lot of commonality. Widespread agreement across the board that Russia is obviously an assertive revisionist power that is looking under Vladimir Putin to expand its influence where possible. For the most part, people that I spoke to thought that Putin can be deterred, that he could be deterred, that he's not looking for conflict, but that he looks for opportunities where they are open. So that was a common theme with Baltic officials in all 3 countries. And of course, the fact that Russia uses a wide array of tools, right, economic, diplomatic, and political, to promote its interests. Now, where there started to be some interesting differences between the different people I interviewed had to do with what exactly to do about it, number one. Number two, the responses already from those 3 countries. And then third, some differences in assessment over what specifically the threat might be, what form the threat might be. So, for example, in what particular form might Russia threaten the Baltic states more aggressively? There were really 4 scenarios, right? The first is flat-out conventional invasion. The second, more subtle, would be some kind of covert action, an incident that's provoked, right, followed by a call for diplomatic resolution. A third scenario might be a more pro-Russian government coming to power in one of these countries. And then a fourth would be cyber attacks. The fourth is already happening every day. That was very clear from the briefings I had. The cyber attacks occur on a daily basis. So in terms of the other three scenarios, there were some differences between the countries in terms of the likelihood of it. Latvian officials, for example, worried more about the possibility of a pro-Russian government coming to power. They worried less about just a straightforward invasion. And for some reasons I'll get to in a minute. Lithuanians, on the other hand, were more concerned about the possibility of at some point, of an actual Russian assault on Lithuania. They were less worried about a pro-Russian government in Lithuania because there isn't much pro-Russian sentiment in Lithuania. And as usual, as I found out, Estonia was somewhere in between. That was sort of a common thing. So those are the different possible scenarios. Now, just to sort of explain why, as you may know, Latvia, of the three countries, has the largest minority of Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian Latvians. So this means that in Latvia, and just to correct some misunderstanding in Congress, it is not the case. Apparently some members of the U.S. Congress have visited the Baltics and worried that Latvian Russians might actively welcome an invasion or rise up in support of it. That's actually not the fear. Okay? It's a little more subtle than that. The concern among Latvian officials in the current government, at least over the summer, was that there is a strong enough sentiment among a large number of Latvian Russians that amongst that minority, Russia simply isn't seen as a threat. And the goal would be to have Latvia as a kind of bridge between East and West. So it's a more subtle concern, right? That, however, is a concern in Latvia. Again, there's not as much of that sentiment in Estonia or Lithuania. So some interesting differences between the three countries in that sense. And quite a bit of uncertainty when it comes down to specifically what might Putin do next, right? What might he do next month or next year? I mean, a lot of uncertainty in all three countries. So then you get to the problem of deterrence. I was impressed, actually, for the most part, at what these three countries have already done to bolster their own capabilities and cooperation in relation to Russia. There's increased cooperation between the three of them. Their defense spending is up. In a number of cases, it's at the 2% or is on track to be at 2%, this marker that obviously President Trump takes very seriously. There are defense leagues, riflemen's unions. There's a commitment to civic education, patriotic education, cyber defense. So I was impressed. For example, when I asked officials in different countries, what would local military and paramilitary figures do in your country if there was some covert action, some violent incident that occurred, but that wasn't a flat-out invasion, something on a regional scale? And they said, we would shoot them. And that was a consistent answer. And I liked that answer. Because the reason I liked it is you're talking about people who are ready to fight for themselves. And I think from an American point of view, it's encouraging to know that you have allies that are ready to defend themselves, spend on their own defense, right there. It's a sort of strategy of they understand how much weaker they are than Russia, but they are going to fight. They are absolutely ready to fight. That came through very clearly. They have actually passed laws in some of these countries insisting that soldiers on the front line may not refuse to fight if they are ordered to do so by their civilian superiors. So in other words, they're not going to repeat the experience in 1940. Political leaders may not, by law, may not instruct those soldiers not to fight. They must fight. So again, that's the kind of ally you want. How much time do I have left?
Oh, I'd say 10 minutes.
10 minutes left still? Okay, okay, great. All right, sure. So, that was a good answer, and it's the kind of ally you're looking for. And actually, one of the pleasant surprises was that before I went there this summer, I had been told by people whose advice I took seriously that the Baltics are an energy island. Well, as it turns out, they're not. You may know this already. But Lithuania, for example, you have a liquefied natural gas terminal completed a couple of years ago. That means that the Baltics are much less dependent on Russia in that area than they were. There are still weaknesses and vulnerabilities on the electricity network. But when it comes to oil and gas, it's less of a vulnerability than it was. So that's good news. All three countries see Ukraine as a kind of front line in their own defenses. So they actually take the Ukraine theater very seriously for geopolitical reasons, not only humanitarian ones. They think that the fight must be conducted in Ukraine to protect the Baltics, and that came through very clearly as well. So in general, I thought there were some impressive actions being taken in all three countries in the interest of self-defense. So then the problem is deterrence, right? And this was obvious. I mean, this is what's on everybody's mind, I think, in the Baltics as well as here in Washington for those who do think about the Baltics, which is you're talking about countries that even when they make every effort to defend themselves are so much smaller than Russia that you have the question of the credibility of deterrence. So deterrence can take two forms, of course, deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment. With deterrence by denial, you're hoping to actually stop an aggressor in its tracks. With deterrence by punishment, you're threatening to make life very difficult for them, even if you can't actually deny their advances. I'm not sure that deterrence by denial, to be completely blunt, I'm not sure that deterrence by denial in the Baltics is actually in effect. I mean, there seemed to be some uncertainty. I had mixed impressions. There's no question that Russian forces would be slowed down and a lot of damage could be done, but I did get the impression that deterrence by denial may be problematic. So in a way, we're relying on deterrence by punishment, and then the question is that credible? Are NATO allies, including the United States, willing and ready to fight for the Baltics if they are attacked, whether it's a full-scale assault or whether it's some small event, some local covert event, right, that brings NATO into question? How would major allies like the United States, France, Britain, and Germany actually respond in that kind of event? As you can imagine, the Baltic officials are eager to hear reassurances from Washington and from other Western capitals that we'd have their back, right? I mean, naturally, that's what you'd expect. Now, for the most part, the good news is I think they're getting those reassurances from the current administration. They're very reassured by the context they've had from a variety of officials, military to military, diplomatic. The U.S. presence in the region has increased this year. Leading cabinet members and right up to President Trump have sort of said the right things repeatedly. So that's good news. That's reassuring. They do look for consistent signals of support. I emphasize the word consistent from the presidential level on down. That's something that they do look for. And there is this one dilemma in particular geographically, the Suwalki Gap, if I'm not mispronouncing it, which I learned a lot about while I was there. So in other words, there's a sliver of territory where Lithuania borders Poland and where Kaliningrad is separated from Belarus. And so the concern is this a defensible spot? If there was a conflict with Russia, you can imagine a scenario where Russia is able to deploy a lot more troops in the early stages of the conflict than NATO is, and using anti-access area denial, air power, naval, even right up to nuclear threats, and you can use Kaliningrad as a base of operations to cut back across that gap, right? You can essentially cut off the Baltics from the rest of NATO, and that is obviously a very live concern. And it struck me that even though NATO has these multinational battalions on the ground, right, they're led by Canada, Britain, and Germany, there actually isn't much of a U.S. permanent presence in the Baltics per se. I mean, there are Americans on the ground, but it's not a country that's taking the lead in those three countries in the same way that it is in Poland. And everybody knows that. Everybody understands the difference between Americans and any other NATO ally. I mean, the Americans are the ones that have the weight. The Americans are the ones that, in the words of one Lithuanian official, are understood by the Russians, and he meant this as a compliment, to be a little crazy, and they might actually fight. Okay, the Americans might actually fight. To be completely blunt, the way that Germans, for example, are deployed in Lithuania, it can be a little disturbing because they're under extremely tight rules of engagement, extremely tight, right? So seems to be a little bit of worry in Lithuania about that. So the question is, will deterrence actually hold if it comes to it? Deterrence by punishment or deterrence by denial? Ultimately, that's kind of up to us and other major Western powers. I came to the conclusion, so one of the questions I asked everyone I met, who seemed, the relevant officials, defense officials especially, was to say, would you even welcome a bolstered U.S. permanent presence on the ground? And I was kind of surprised. Sometimes I got the answer no. Actually, in Latvia, the answer was generally no. The answer was essentially we don't want an increased U.S. permanent presence in Latvia. And the answer seemed to be for several reasons. One was we don't have the logistical capacity. We're quite happy with the existing commitment. We don't want to provoke the Russians. That was the answer. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting differences between the three. Lithuanians, again, on the other end of the spectrum, were very clear, yes. The more Americans, the better, right? We worry about this, and we would love to have Americans on the ground because we find that reassuring, and that's the way to bolster deterrence. Estonia, as usual, sort of in the middle. So the conclusion I came to was that, it's one area where I have to say I really agree with the current administration is to say that U.S. national interests come first. That's the right criteria for judging how the U.S. should act. In my view, actually, the U.S. has two main broad sets of interests in relation to this area. One, and these are not ranked according to their importance. They're both critical. One is to avoid war with Russia, which could be horrific in its implications. Another is to support NATO and America's European allies as a system that is open, democratic, stable, balanced, right? And it seems to me that the only way you can pursue both sets of U.S. interests at the same time is to successfully deter Russia. So insofar as there's any possibility that Vladimir Putin might misread American intentions in the region, it seems to me to be worthwhile making it crystal clear, even more than we already have, that if Russia commits an aggression in the region, it will be met with force. I mean, that is what he understands. That is actually a way to avoid war, not to provoke it, in my view. And so just to provoke conversation today and in this article, and really I take this as a starting point because I don't claim to be, an operational expert at the level of, some of the people you'll have through here. But I think it would be worth seriously considering having, for example, a permanent U.S. military presence on the ground in Lithuania, north of that gap, to make it clear to the Russians that if they attack the Baltic states, they will meet American units on the ground. And that might be a way to help prevent conflict. And we can talk about the details and whether it makes sense or whether it's possible. You wouldn't want to actually, I'm not talking about multiple brigades. I'm not talking about some of the proposals that have been out there. For example, RAND. I think that really would be provocative. But if you're talking about a small number of troops, to make it clear that, if you attack the Baltics, you will actually run into U.S. troops. That just is going to give the Russians that extra pause. And I think that's one way you can preserve both sets of U.S. interests at the same time, which is prevent war with Russia and preserve this system that extends the Baltics, which is U.S. friendly, and that, might not last forever, because as one Lithuanian suggested to me, winter is coming.
Okay, grim predictions. Jacob, over to you.
Thanks, Colin. I agree with everything Colin has said, so there's not much I can say. And whatever I'll say, it will be a sort of repetition of of his assessment and his points. But I guess for the sake of speaking for 10 minutes, let me just make two sets of points following Colin's presentation. The first one is on the assessment of the threat. And here, again, I agree fully with Colin. The threat is quite clear. Russia has demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to use force to alter very quickly facts on the ground. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Ukraine, both Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, and even the most recent, a month and a half ago, exercises, the Zapad 2017, have indicated that Russia is capable of deploying a large amount of forces very quickly to their border and to Europe's eastern frontier, up to 100,000 troops in these exercises, which is quite a lot, and it does alter the balance of power in the region in an unfavorable way, not just for the Balts, but for the rest of Europe. So that's really the first point of the assessment, that we should not underestimate the willingness and ability of Russia to use force. And as a footnote here, we often focus on the sort of the cyber threat, the soft threat, the subversion threat of Russia, which is real. It's there, has increased, but that threat does not mean that the conventional military hard threat of Russia has decreased. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. And here's my second point. I think Russia uses a whole spectrum, as Colin said, a whole spectrum of tools, from the soft tools, the subversion, the corruption, the cyber attacks, disinformation, to the much more mundane, if you want, but historically quite effective tools of military power. The war in Ukraine has seen all of it, but has seen a lot of artillery barrages too. So it's not just corruption, subversion, buying political parties, assassinations in Ukraine. It has included a lot of conventional forces and old-fashioned artillery barrages. And I think that has to be taken into consideration as a serious threat on not just in Ukraine, but in the Baltic countries and along the whole Europe's eastern frontier. Last point on assessment of threat, quickly. The regional balance, I think, favors still Russia because both of a variety of factors. One is Europe has underinvested in its own security over the past decades and in military capabilities in particular. And additional to that, our concerns are not just limited to Europe. Obviously, we are focused on the Middle East, Asia, certainly Latin America. We have global concerns, and Europe is just one of the many geopolitical concerns that we have. And therefore, we cannot focus all of our attention or all of our resources in the region. So the regional balance of power at the end of the day still favors Russia. From our perspective, and here's why I think this is different than the Cold War in many ways, is that we face a threat across the globe that is comes from different actors along different geographic front lines. They uses multiple means across multiple domains, if you want to use a term that the military likes to use. It's not just land, sea, space, and air. It's also cyber, it's political, it's economic. And that means that we are really spread out. The threat is not just focused on the Fulda Gap during the Cold War in Germany, or in this case, just on the Baltic countries or the Suwałki Gap. It's geographically very spread out, and it uses, and it comes from different actors. It's just not just the Soviet Union, or Russia in this case. It comes from Russia, it comes from Iran, North Korea, China, and not to mention all the non-state actors associated with Islamist terror. So we are, we lack, we don't have a sort of a source or something that forces us to focus attention on one thing. We are, again, even in my daily job, we're interested in a lot of issues, and the Baltics and in general Europe is just one of them. So what that means is that a rival such as Russia has a certain advantage because they can focus on one region. They can focus on one frontier. In this case, it's their western frontier along Europe. So the threat is real, and the threat is different than before. What do we do? What should we do? And that's my second point. Can we deter it? I agree with Colin. Russia can be deterred. And we have done so far, I think, a lot over the past several years at this point. We are clearly and consistently committed to NATO and Article 5, and this administration and the previous ones have repeated that commitment in multiple ways and often. And over the past couple of years, and including the past year, we have actually done a lot, both in the Baltics and in the area in general. As Colin mentioned, the Enhanced Present Forces, the EFP, which are led indeed not by U.S. in the Baltics, right? It's UK, Canada, and Germany. U.S. leads the EFP forces in Poland. But broadly, I think it indicates a U.S. Interest and willingness to devote a lot of attention and resources to the region. One footnote here, as you mentioned, the Suwałki Gap is an important sort of geographic component of of the threat and therefore on how to deter. And that's why I think the U.S. presence in Poland or leading the forces in Poland is essential for that, because it deters an attack against the Suwałki Gap, and therefore, by doing so, it enhances the security of the Baltics. Sure, we can debate whether we should have more troops in the Baltics or not, but I think it's not just that we're focused on deterring and attacking as Poland. I think by being there, we are enhancing the security of the Baltics themselves. And there are many things that we can do to increase that. I mean, one of the things that General Hodges has been saying over the past several years is the called military Schengen, ability essentially to project power along the frontier or the front line with ease under peacetime conditions. If war happens, all bets are gone. But under peacetime conditions, for purposes of deterrence, we need to speed up the movement of troops along the front line. That involves a lot of political decisions, but also building up, for instance, infrastructure in the region. But again, the point here is that we're doing a lot, and I think we're going to do more in the coming years. And here's my main point here on how to deter. I think the threat ultimately is very localized, in that Russia is not interested in invading Germany or sending tanks to Paris at this point, which it can't, presumably. We're not going to get there. But a threat is limited to a certain degree to a geographic area, the front line, even though I think the objective is much larger than that, right? It's probably the demise of NATO and of sort of the larger success of the European political, economic, and security model. But given that the threat is contained, limited geographically, and to certainly even the cyber threat, it attacks not just in the Baltics but elsewhere, sort of slivers of the electorate, right? The best responder to that type of threat has to be local. Local threats are best addressed by local forces, at least in the most immediate term. So, yes, I think the 2% spending number is an important sort of metric of how much the locals are willing to put up in terms of resources for their own defense. But it's not just a pet peeve of the Trump administration. It has been, a constant. Well, first of all, it's not a number that the Trump administration invented, right? It's something that all NATO allies have agreed upon to spend, and has been something that previous administrations at different levels. And I think usually the tradition is the Secretary of Defense goes to NATO on his last trips, and the speech is always roughly the same. Spend more. You have to invest in your investment, in your security, and the 2% is again a sort of a quick number to dangle in front of the Europeans who are not spending that. And there are multiple reasons for that. I mean, there's definitely U.S. domestic political reasons for that, right? It's hard to go to Pennsylvania, Ohio, and if there's a question of foreign policy, you're the expert on this field. But if there's a question of foreign policy, usually it's about, well, why are our allies not spending for their own defense? And then you have a hard time explaining, if you're running for whatever position, you have a hard time explaining why are defending allies that are not spending that much. But I think it's more than that. I think it has to do with the nature of the threat. And the nature of the threat, again, is localized, right? It's Narva, it's the Suwałki Gap, it's a sliver of the electorate, it's a particular cell tower in Lithuania, it's a particular bank attacked by, through cyber means by, Russian, who knows who, based in a building, run by the FSB, right? So, who can respond best to that, right? It's probably not us. We can serve as a catalyst. We can serve as an insurance against a catastrophic failure of deterrence. But the first responder has to be local. And that's why I think, the Baltic countries are good examples. They're spending more, and they're taking security in the different domains, right? Estonia is leading in many ways the development of counter cyber activities and all the different sort of malign influences that Russia has developed over the past decades, not just the past year. It's a good example of again, three small but important allies that are willing to invest in their own security and develop local capabilities to address certain threats that are local. That doesn't not mean that we're not there, that we're absent, that we just come in, if really everything goes down the drain. No, I think that's it's too little, too late. We have to be present, and I think one role that we have is that of I don't know exactly what term we can use, but of a catalyst. We can provide tools. We can help them develop tools. We can coordinate. We can lead the wider alliance in coordinating and maintaining a coherent posture in the region. But in many ways, the initiative has to come from them. Last point I'll mention, and that's Ted's domain and expertise, but a lot of our efforts in Europe have often, especially from after World War II, I think, have did not come just out of the State Department or the Pentagon or Heritage Foundation, right? Usually there were a certain set of incentives that the local Europeans had that we figure out what they were, and we helped them develop those incentives. Developed a coordination, gave them the means in some cases, if you go back to the late 40s, to follow on those incentives. So in this case, I think the incentives are there. I think that the Baltic countries are great examples of states that have, and Poland in the wider region, I think, in large measure, has the right incentives. They may not have yet the capabilities. So we can't provide them with incentives. They have them, and they're good incentives. And our role should be that to provide the capabilities, both military, but the wider political capabilities of coherence and coordination in Europe. I'll end it there.
Great. Well, let me wrap up fairly quickly with a slightly broader view on U.S. policy towards Russia in general. I entirely agree with Colin's remarks and with Jakob's remarks. I think you could do a lot worse as mottos for U.S. foreign policy than the first one, stick up for your friends, and the second one, help people who want to help themselves. That will get you very far in the world of U.S. foreign policy, I think. I have to admit that I approached this panel with a slight sense of deja vu. About 8 or so years ago, we at the Heritage Foundation led the campaign against President Obama's New START agreement. We were unsuccessful in that campaign against a treaty that we continue to believe is seriously, fundamentally flawed. 6 years ago, we led a major campaign against President Obama's Russia reset policy. I hosted Garry Kasparov in a speech given upstairs, an initiative that was led by then Speaker of the House, John Boehner. I have to say that initiative also did not meet with success. 2 years ago, we published a major paper on comprehensive U.S. strategy towards Russia. A few copies of that are available right outside the auditorium here. That paper also, unfortunately, met with no administration response. Well, now it's cool to be worried about Russia. But I would just ask this question. What, apart from disliking President Trump, are all these new converts to worrying about what Russia are proposing to actually do about Russia? My sense is that they propose precisely nothing. I have heard no serious responses in the realm of foreign policy from all of the professional Russia worriers over the last year or so. Well, we do have proposals, and of course they're available outside and on our website. What did we say in this paper, which I think still holds up quite well today? We argued that Russia is tactically very strong, but strategically quite weak. It's tactically strong partly because its inherent advantages, its size, the modernization of its military, etc. But tactically, it's also strong because it has no great need to be consistent. It can do one thing and then turn around and do the other the next day. With no democratic accountability, there's no need to maintain a day-to-day consistency in policy. We also argued it's strategically weak, however, and I will get into that in just a moment. Finally, we concluded that the basis of Russia's foreign policy, at least under Putin, is to create the image of strength. and to prevent the establishment on Russia's borders of any independent democratic states. Not because Russia fears an assault from the nation of Georgia or Lithuania, that's ridiculous, but because the establishment of independent democratic nations on Russia's borders might give Russians the idea that perhaps they deserve something a little bit better than Vladimir Putin. Now, there are the long-term weaknesses of Russia, which led us to include it strategically fairly weak. Foremost among these are its economy. We will, at the Heritage Foundation, publish either later this week or early next week a fairly extensive paper on the state of Russia's economy. The paper is not flattering. It concludes that Russia has weathered the collapse in oil prices relatively well, but notes that its Central Reserve Fund has shrunk dramatically over the last several years. And even more interestingly, in a way, Russia's exports of goods other than petroleum products have not increased in spite of a dramatic fall in the value of the ruble. Normally, one would expect that if a currency declines, the exports of that country would become more competitive and would increase. That's not happened for Russia. It indicates that Russian manufacturing is uncompetitive at any plausible level of the Russian ruble simply because it's not good enough. So the Russian economy is going to continue to rely for the foreseeable future on oil, which it appears unlikely is going to reach the $100 or $120 barrel again for the foreseeable future. It was for this reason that we in 2015 proposed a policy towards Russia, not of containment, which was the Cold War policy, but a policy of constrainment. That is, we argued that the United States should systematically seek to impose costs on Russia when Russia does things that we find undesirable in order to constrain Russia's decision-making going forward. In other words, in part, to advance a policy of deterrence by changing the Russian calculation about how their actions would pay off. Now, we argued that the way to advance a policy of constrainment was to talk about cost imposition. This works well against a place like Russia, or has the potential to work well at least, precisely because the Russian economy is relatively weak, and therefore they are less able to pay heavy costs over the long run than the United States is. Now, costs are not simply financial. There are reputational costs, there are diplomatic costs, and there are a lot of other kinds of costs, including, of course, military costs. The essence of a cost imposition strategy is that it works over the long run against adversaries that aren't able to keep on paying forever at a high rate. Now, if you're following a cost imposition strategy, you don't necessarily meet like with like. In strategic terms, if you want to use that lingo, you act asymmetrically. Just because, for example, Russia invades Ukraine, you don't necessarily have to limit your responses to a military one in Ukraine just because the Russians did that. You might impose costs on Russia in other areas, geographically, and in other domains as a response to Russian actions in Ukraine. But the essence of the strategy that we proposed is that you impose costs on Russia that are disproportionate to the gains that it achieves from actions that we don't like. Now, in our 2015 report, we set out about 100 recommendations, many, though not all of them, aimed at imposing costs. I have to admit we were not terribly hopeful that our recommendations would be followed because, and I find this absolutely incredible, Vladimir Putin has successfully fooled President George W. Bush into believing that he was a cooperative partner. He successfully fooled President Obama in believing he was a cooperative partner. And for that matter, he successfully fooled Secretary of State Hillary Clinton into believing that he was a cooperative partner. The U.S. track record here is one of remarkable gullibility. And I find that incredible because Colin Dueckon have pointed out that the Russian history of aggressive actions in Europe does not begin with Ukraine. There is the nation of Georgia in 2008, of course, but it goes even further back than that. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in Russia really began with the Second Chechen War in 1999 to 2000. This is a man who rose to power by winning a war that Boris Yeltsin lost. So he has real form in this regard. And with that track record, I find it amazing that U.S. presidents have been so gullible in this regard. We ended the paper with a nice quote from Winston Churchill, which addressed this persistent temptation among American politicians to believe they can talk the Russians into better behavior. And the quote was from 1943. Winston Churchill had just received another abusive letter from Stalin accusing the British of all sorts of bad faith and bad intentions and malign actions. And Churchill writes a wonderful memo where he says, "Experience has convinced me that it is useless to argue with Soviet people. The only thing to do is to present them with a response and then await their action." In other words, don't try to argue them into good behavior, confront them with a fact, and then respond accordingly. I think Churchill's advice was absolutely right in 1943, and I think it continues to be right today. If you want to translate it into slightly more modern lingo, however, you could go to the great British rock band The Who, "Won't get fooled again." So I hope. Today, the opportunity to follow a cost imposition strategy is still there. Vladimir Putin has done nothing to improve the Russian economy, which now ranks as the single most corrupt economy in the world. He has spent heavily on the Russian military, which is now far more capable and much more dangerous than it was in 2008 during the Russian attack on the nation of Georgia. But fortunately, Russia's economic situation now limits the possibilities for further modernization. Moreover, Putin, to my mind, clearly hoped to take more of Ukraine than he was actually able to seize. I think he expected to take almost half of it. Now he is stuck with a low cost, relatively speaking, low casualty, but persistent war with over a very limited slice of Ukraine, which promises no significant gains and no easy resolution. That is not the situation that he expected to be in when he attacked Ukraine. Now, if I were Vladimir Putin, and I'm glad I'm not, I would badly want to distract from this unfortunate state of affairs by focusing domestic and international attention on anything other than the situation in Ukraine. That is why I find Colin's work on the Baltics so worrying, because the Baltics are one area in which a plausible Russian distraction might present itself. The Baltics clearly view Ukraine as their front line. I can entirely understand why they take that point of view, but precisely because the situation from the Russian point of view in Ukraine is so unpromising, that may actually increase the threat to the Baltics. I found it extremely troubling that 2 years ago, in the summer of 2015, Putin laid the groundwork for causing further difficulties in the Baltics by arguing that Baltic independence from the Soviet Union was illegal. And he has said that publicly and repeatedly. Vladimir Putin is not the kind of man to say those things without having a reason for saying them. I find that extremely sinister. And that is why I find Colin's report so troubling, because this is not, as he very rightly notes, simply a question of war or peace. There are a lot of gradations between those two extremes, and Vladimir Putin and Russia in general have proved that they are expert in inciting them and taking advantage of them. So when the Baltic nations expect trouble, I fear they have very ample reason to expect that, and unfortunately, I fear they may be right.
All right, thank you. Thank you to the panel. We have time for some questions. If I could just take the liberty of asking the first one. All of this brings back a lot of echoes of the Cold War, and I grew up in a small country very close to the Baltics, Denmark, which was back then on the front line of the Warsaw Pact and the Warsaw Pact invasion plans of Western Europe. I remember Sunday papers full of stories about Polish soldiers learning Danish for a reason that they were going to show up on our shores at one point or another. Or Soviet invasion plans have been found in somebody's suitcase. So all of this, I certainly sympathize with the plights of the other people of the Baltic states. Where does, if you could briefly, Colin, describe where do the Baltics fit into the NATO strategic planning vis-a-vis Russia, I guess, specifically? Is there a master plan for their defense, or are we still debating that now, or what?
I'm not sure if Jakob wants to take it first. No.
Yes.
I mean, the briefings that I got First of all, one of the things that was a real pleasure was the briefings in all three countries on defense were very professional, very subtle and sophisticated, but they mostly had to do with the local situation, specifically the military challenge from Russia, the different hybrid covert possibilities, how the Baltics had prepared themselves. I mean, in terms of your question, the big picture, is there a master plan? If there is, either they didn't tell me, or they don't know about it, or there isn't one. I mean, and there's a wide variety of possibilities here. But I think what they're trying to do is make themselves indigestible, and hope that the big Western nations, led by the United States, will actually respond if it comes to that.
Nothing on plans. Okay, Ted.
I know less about plans than Colin does. I would simply suggest that knowledgeable individuals who I've talked to on the wargaming side suggest that a Russian assault on the Baltic nations would probably be over in a matter of 3 or 4 days. These are really very small places, and you'd better hope that that we can win by that we can deter by threatening to impose sufficient costs. But if there is a level of cost that the Russians are willing to pay, it is not a matter of defending the Baltics, it is a matter of liberating them. And that is a very different problem indeed.
And if I can just add to that, one of the reasons why that's so disturbing, I mean, obviously from the Baltic point of view, is that you can count on physical damage and human damage in a scenario like that before the liberation that would be horrific. I mean, it's not as though the Russian military is known for great care when it comes to civilians. So that's obviously a scenario that the Baltics want to avoid, understandably, in the first place.
Yeah.
I would further to that add that it's interesting, Putin's pattern. He's only taken one complete territory, Chechnya. Everything else has been a chunk. What lesson can you draw, if you're the Russians, from the Cold War? Simply that occupying entire foreign nations that hate and resent you is extremely costly, burdensome, and in the end you get very little from it. Much better to take a little sliver and try to Finlandize the rest.
Good point. Okay, well, let's get to the audience down here, Dan.
We do have a microphone going around here.
Coming. Yeah, please identify yourself.
Sure. My name is David Jackson. I'm a former director of Voice of America. A question for Mr. Dueck. I was wondering whether in your interviews with the people in these countries, which I find very interesting, whether you got any sense of how those views are evolving. In other words, are the citizens becoming more worried about Russia invasion or provocation, or less? Are they more willing to look west toward NATO and America? And in other words, how are those views changing?
There's some variety there, depending on who exactly you talk to. So in other words, if you talk to people at the very top, they tend to be very polite and tell you how much they appreciate American support and that they feel very reassured, right? As you go down to the cab drivers, and I literally asked cab drivers, I had one cab driver tell me, we're afraid that the Americans are leaving long term, that's kind of the trend. And when you sort of push people mid-level, and ask them what their concerns are. I mean, there is a concern over the long term as to whether the U.S. is gradually disengaging. And I would actually say the Obama administration, there's a lot of responsibility for that, to tell you the truth. I think there's actually some reassurance this year that the current administration has turned out to be more solidly in support of the Baltics than some people there might have expected initially. So that was actually reassuring. But the long-term trend, I think there is a kind of worry or anxiety. That's why I chose the title that I did, and it's particularly true as you get away from the more formal top-end meetings and sort of have more candid conversations.
How would for the constrainment strategy we're talking about, how would much harsher sanctions from the U.S. on Russia and travel restrictions, would that be effective?
not on their own, but as a part of a broader response, we believe they have a place. We support the Magnitsky legislation. In our view, it doesn't go far enough. We would like to see many more individuals sanctioned under Magnitsky. We would also like to see much more aggressive U.S. and allied pursuit of ill-gotten Russian gains abroad. Cyprus in particular, though not only Cyprus, has a fair amount to answer for here. In our paper, we called on the U.S. to seize illegal Russian holdings, ill-gotten gains abroad, and give them to the nations of Eastern Europe to help fund their own defense. So we're willing to go quite a long way on the sanctions front, but institutionally, I think we're skeptical of the ability of sanctions on their own to achieve results. It's all about imposing costs. We also suggested we should do a lot of other things. For example, the gentleman from Voice of America here, Voice of America in particular, and sort of media in general can play an important role here. I would like to see the United States and the other nations of NATO nations have a much more vigorous strategy of protesting Russian air incursions than we do. We should have, every time, and there are a lot of air incursions over the Baltics, every time one happens, we should be making a big public protest about it. And we should publish pictures of, an F-35 or an F-18, or maybe a couple of them, flying alongside the Russian plane and escorting it back. If these violations persist and become egregious, you announce a shoot-down policy. You have 6 more months, and after that, we will shoot you down. So, at some point, you have to draw a line on this. You cannot keep on putting up with these sort of relentless pinprick attacks. So, sanctions, sure, but we cannot limit ourselves just to sanctions.
Question in the back here?
It's more for the broadcasting system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Łukasz Wyszyński from Polish Naval Academy. Thank you for your speeches. I wondering about one fact that, of course, I could agree that the geopolitical situation of Baltic states is really bad. But the question is, what if we get this day of, I don't know, Russia aggression? Maybe it's military aggression, maybe it's political aggression. And what if NATO cannot react as a one? What will be possible political consequence of situation that NATO cannot agree how to react in the long term? Thank you.
Right. So, I mean, you can imagine, you can spin out any variety of scenarios. It's possible, and from the Baltic point of view, it's worrying that you could have a scenario where, for example, if you had the type of small-scale aggression that Ted outlined, right? One of the scenarios that I suggested, where you have some local aggression, it's covert, it's denied, and then you come up with you use disinformation and claim that some outrage has occurred. All right, and then there's some small territorial seizure. I mean, is that going to really trigger, a massive NATO response? I mean, it might be tempting to say it wouldn't, right? So that's a very tricky situation. And you're talking about in some European countries like Germany, there isn't exactly, a massive will to fight these kinds of situations. So, Merkel is actually most of the people I talked to like Merkel. They found her personally reassuring and stabilizing, but. I mentioned the point about German troops in Lithuania. This is a serious issue. It's one of the reasons why I think they wanted Americans on the ground, because Germans are under very strict rules of engagement. You can imagine scenarios where some event occurs and you don't get the desired response. You don't get that kind of firm response. So it's possible. I'll leave it at that.
Well, anything is possible, but 3 points. One is, I think, look, I mean, if there's one certainty in international relations is the Article 5. I think, we've been, again, very committed to it. Having said that, though, I mean, the Russian threat may be under the threshold of the Article 5, right? So the small incursion under confusing circumstances, right? But that does not necessarily mean that there won't be a help from the alliance. In fact, I think one can, again, we were talking about hypotheticals and possible scenarios. It is possible to think of a scenario like this that does not call for Article 5 because it's a confusing circumstance. And a lot of allies are actually willing to help because it may involve not a full-out war, but it may involve sending a police force to stop the motorcycle gang of hairy-chested Russians in Estonia, right? Or some other circumstance like this. That a lot of Europeans, European allies, may be actually happy to help because it's not Article 5. It's not a full-out direct confrontation with Russia, right? And final last point, and I guess it goes back actually to the points I mentioned before. I think, we should not be overly pessimistic about the ability of a small country to defend itself. For a variety of reasons. Large, trend seems to me that over the past several decades, it has proven to be very difficult for a large country, an industrial superpower, to conquer and maintain stability over a territory, right? Going back from the 60s, Vietnam, Afghanistan for the Soviets, look at Afghanistan and Iraq for us. Their technological advantages now to being small and lethal. You do not need to be a massive industrial power to create serious problems for another power, right? So yes, we can say that the Baltics are small, they're flat, but it's not as, it's not just, I actually don't think if the Baltic countries are serious about defense, this is a 3-day war, even assuming that the Russians want to drive divisions of armored forces to the capitals. So again, I think there's a lot of things that can be done without calling necessarily for Article 5, which can actually succeed both in defeating a Russian incursion and ultimately deterring one.
I mean, I very much hope you're right about that. I guess I share the concern that's sort of inherent in your question. This is not hardly the first time this issue has come up. I'm thinking of the Obama administration's actions in Libya, which essentially turned NATO into a coalition of the willing. That may, I hope it's not the case, but that may be the future for a lot of NATO operations, coalitions of the willing. Now, Article 5, of course, I mean, it's a different situation. Libya is not an Article 5 scenario. Lithuania would be. I hope that would make a difference. And I hope it would make a major difference. But I'm not 100% convinced that, let's say, the nation of Spain, not to pick on them, would want to rally to the defense of Latvia. It is, after all, a very long way away. This gentleman has been waiting here.
Just give me a second. Thank you. Hi, my name's John Baer. I'm a recipient of the Charles Koch Foundation Research Grant and Grant Strategy through SAS at SMU. And I'm doing my research on Russian grand strategy and potential U.S. responses. So as you can imagine, I've been sitting here furiously scribbling down what you guys are saying. But more to the point, and I would like to preface this by saying that this is not my view, but this is a view that I have come across repeatedly in my research, and I'd be interested in your gentlemen's insights on it. Several experts in this field have written that it would be in the United States' interest to pursue a strategy of non-engagement should a Baltic contingency occur. And the reason being, and the logic behind it, that if you look at Ukraine and how it has imposed such heavy economic costs on the Russian Federation, that they pretty much have hit a wall in Ukraine. A similar thing could happen in the Baltics, so much so that it would spread the Russians so thin that they would have to turn away from where the real U.S. interests are in, say, Asia and perhaps the Middle East. And there's a question in there somewhere, but I'm interested in what you gentlemen have to think about that.
I wouldn't recommend it because we've already, I mean, these are our allies. We've made that commitment. So I think it's probably unwise to assume that if we just pretend that the commitment doesn't exist in an actual aggression, that wouldn't hurt U.S. interests. I mean, it would be devastating. It would basically reveal that NATO is hollow, that the U.S. is not a European power, that Russia's free to continue to expand. One of the things that the authors, I'm not sure exactly who you're talking about, but I think I know some of them personally, so let me just speculate. There's a school of thought known as offshore balancing, which you may be studying, which suggests that the U.S. can kind of indefinitely retreat and that the bad guys won't fill the gap and that everything will be fine. And one of the problems with that school of thought is it doesn't take seriously the possibility that the bad guys will fill the gap. And historically, that actually happens pretty frequently. So you're making a number of gambles when you switch to a more detached posture like that. You're gambling that authoritarian aggressors won't take advantage of it. You're gambling that the long-term expense won't be tremendous, dwarfing any short-term savings. You're gambling that you won't have to be pulled back into it later. I mean, we sort of went through this after World War I, right? We tried offshore balancing, and it didn't work out. And then what you get is reentry costs. And June 6, 1944 was an example of that. It's expensive. D-Day was expensive, It's safer to just remain engaged and deter conflict in the first place. So that's what I'd recommend.
Yeah, we did not advocate a strategy of very strong U.S. involvement in absolutely every area around Russia. U.S. does have interests in Central Asia. I don't want to give the impression I'm throwing them to the wolves, but frankly, I don't think that we can creditably argue that our interests in Central Asia will permit us to have as serious and as long-term a response as we do to our NATO allies. That to me is just not a sustainable argument. So we argued for a more slightly back foot strategy in Central Asia. We don't think that the possibilities of a Russian-Chinese tie-up are really very serious. It always reminds me of a little bit, how do you know if two bad guys are really cooperating if they're merely trying to stab each other in the back? So, we're not quite so concerned about that. The premise in your question was the Russians might spread themselves too thin. I recall that was said when the Russians intervened in Syria, right? The Russians will never get anywhere here. They're spreading themselves too thin. They're going to take very heavy costs trying to stabilize the Syrian situation. Well, as a matter of fact, they didn't take very heavy costs. And with the judicious, or maybe I should say injudicious, application of air power, they were able to stabilize the situation for President Assad and play a very significant role in keeping him in power and in thereby building the Iranian land bridge from Iraq through Syria across to Lebanon. Well, I think that inflicted enormous strategic damage on the United States, never mind potentially to the nation of Israel, and indeed to the people who are unfortunate enough to live in these nations. Did the Russians pay an exorbitant cost for this action? Not at all. Have they paid an exorbitant cost for Ukraine? They've certainly paid a cost. They paid a higher cost than they expected to, and I would certainly agree with the premise of your question, which is that the route to world power does not run through seizing Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Chechnya, and a chunk of Ukraine. This is not going to make Russia a superpower again. The only thing that can do that is a revived Russian economy, and I feel fairly confident in saying that South Ossetia is not the route to a stronger Russian economy. But really, are the Baltic nations on their own going to pose such a tremendous burden that Russia would find it insupportable? Only if we took extremely vigorous actions in response, not on their own.
I think we'd also have to just consider the cost to American credibility as a global power, to our treaty obligations, and we saw with President Obama's red line in Syria, which was carelessly crossed as soon as it was drawn in the sand, that it did definitely affect American credibility and added, I think, to the instability that we've seen in that region ever since. So a kind of stepping back from our obligations in the Baltics, I'm sure, will carry a similar cost. Should we have one last question right there?
Where was it? Oh. Hi there, Mark Newton, formerly with the British Ministry of Defence and now with CNAS. I can't speak for Spain, but I would like to just reassure that the UK remains committed to the situation in the Baltics, and I believe NATO does as a whole. I'd like to ask the panel how they think that we, the Alliance, would respond if we saw the sub-Article 5 action that we've spoken about here. If we saw something similar to the little green men approach that took place in the Ukraine, where forces came across from Russia in non-uniform and blanket denials were issued from Moscow that they were anything to do with the Russian state. If we saw a similar approach take place in the Balts, how do you think the US, how do you think the Alliance, the Baltic states themselves should and will respond?
All right, Colin.
By the way, I will say that the Latvians and Estonians made it clear that the British and Canadian forces on the ground were very welcome and very professional and ready to fight. So that's appreciated. The little green men scenario is again, it's a little bit like the question that came up before, and so we talked about the different possibilities with that. I guess we've canvassed, what the sort of major power response might be, but it is worth coming back to Jakob's point that all is not lost. I mean, the Baltic states themselves have really interesting and robust responses on that exact scenario. I mean, they've done a lot the last few years. When I quoted the multiple people literally giving me the same response, I don't think they were talking to each other. I think it just was a coincidence. They all said the same thing, which is, if we have some local covert threat, we will just fight. I mean, we're ready. And these array of paramilitaries, riflemen's unions, defense leagues, there's a sense of kind of civic readiness. It's not just that there's military options ready, it's that the nation as a people is being prepared to fight, right? So it's impressive, and there's always more that can be done. But I would actually agree with Jakob on the sort of do not despair theme, which might be a good way to end it as we get close to the end of the session, which is, after all, Putin is being deterred. I mean, Russia's not being deterred by cyber. I mean, there is no deterrence on that at the moment. But when it comes to any outright invasion, it hasn't happened yet. So obviously, all is not lost. I mean, there is a sense in which Russia is in fact being deterred now. So it wouldn't be fair to say that deterrence isn't holding. I mean, he obviously must think that there is some cost, possibly quite severe or uncertain, that he would incur if he engaged in some serious invasion of the Baltics, or even a more small scale, or else he would have done it already. So deterrence is holding, and we need to make sure that it can be bolstered. And it is not unreasonable for the American public or President Trump to say we expect our allies to do more. That's a reasonable expectation. As Jakob has said, there's lots of little things that can be done that have effects that are not so little. I mean, in Estonia, I was struck by the fact it's almost an island in a way, geopolitically. They were very calm. There wasn't a sense of panic. But people pointed out, they said, look, we can try to cooperate more with the Finns, with the Swedes, right? With one another. We can rely on U.S. air defenses. It doesn't have to take a lot of troops or a lot of money, but the air power, the sea element can be useful. So a little can go a long way. It doesn't have to be massive numbers of American troops on the ground. So if I gave the impression, I mean, maybe I come across as grim because that's just temperamental. But actually, I believe it can be done, and I believe we should do more to make sure that these scenarios do not materialize. And it's quite possible partly because we have solid allies like Britain.
Three quick points to that. I think the first one is to repeat in many ways what Colin said. I think if it's sub-Article 5, the first thing that matters, it depends what the locals will do. If they don't fight, then their allies are not going to come in. So the first responders have to be the local responders. And in this case, I think the Baltic countries are pretty clear. And that, I think, has changed over the past, say, 5, 6, 7 years. Yeah. If you asked them 5, 7, 6 years ago, they were like, I don't know, we'll see, Now the answer is, we'll shoot. And I think that's good, because without that, we're not going to come in if they're not willing to do that. So that's one. Second, because they're willing to do that, there will be immediate costs imposed on a small, under Article 5 type of attack, which then pushes Russia to consider whether they should do something bigger. If it's something bigger, then it's no longer sub-Article 5, and it becomes much clearer that the response needs to be a much more, if there's several divisions as opposed to a bunch of guys on motorcycle, little green men, there's a whole different story. So you're deterring a small action, pushing the enemy or the rival to consider a bigger action, which has other cost and other impact. And finally, last point, again, on the consideration of sub-Article 5, let's remember that, especially in the region, there are states like Finland, they're not NATO members. And they do play a role in deterring Russia in this case, partly because of their own territorial considerations, their own history, but partly because there's cooperation among these states, which is sort of on the margins of NATO under, maybe the EU umbrella in many ways, which is beneficial to the larger deterrent. So again, not everything has to be considered under the umbrella of Article 5, and there's tons of actions that do occur to deter sort of under the threshold of the Article 5.
I'm glad Colin is closing on an optimistic note here. Just sort of a point and then a concern to end on. One reason the Russians made less ground in Ukraine than I believe they hoped to make and expected to make was because various other regional uprisings were crushed by the locals, frequently rather violently. Good job. The warning is that we in the West are very much inclined to be sympathetic when a minority population in a nation complains it's being oppressed. And Putin and Russia have tried assiduously to foster this impression. In some cases, in the nation of Georgia, they've helped to create a minority population by ethnic cleansing out the original population and substituting in Russians. Or you can give people passports to make them Russians. I mean, there are all sorts of sort of avenues you can follow here. I think we have to be very wary of our own tendency to sympathize with a minority that claims it's being oppressed. That is a tool that can be used against us, and Vladimir Putin has shown that he is willing and able to use it against us. So we have to guard against being manipulated by those sorts of well-meaning but extremely dangerous, in this context, concerns.
Okay, very good warning. Thank you very much to Colin and to the rest of our panelists, and let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Colin.